All right, then that should be it. I will start sharing my application, my presentation. So please note that I would say if you have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and just speak up and interrupt me because I might not be able to see it well. And it ideally should be a conversation. There will be a few moments where I would invite you to contribute, and please do that, use that opportunity because it would be great to kind of have a more conversation. I will now share my screen. I gave them from beginning. Can you all see my presentation well?
Yeah.
In a present mode? Thanks, James. Awesome. So today we will again talk about the management of long-term projects in EYP. This is heavily based on the blueprint of the international sessions that we use and that we organize, which are 2 to 2.5 years projects. Also longer if you include a significant post-session period, evaluation, reflection, and reporting. But on that note, I do want to say that it's also not just that. I will try to cover some of the very essential points. So this will not go very in depth, but I hope that the conversations that we have in the process and the questions and discussions are going to lead us to a more in-depth processes. So feel free to either challenge things that you see or add on that, or yes, that will be it for an introduction point. I would start with a bit of when we talk about the long-term projects, we talk about EYP setting. And of course, it's good to know that EYP is present in 40 countries across Europe, and that organizational practices and project management can differ a lot across different countries. So what I say here is not to be taken for granted as a must or as a necessity, but rather as a practice that we've kind of now synchronized. And it's a bit of a synthesis in a way of practices that we've received in the EYP office and the EYP team. I want to start with the most generic thing is that to maybe define a bit together, what do you think are the long-term projects for you? And I would maybe even ask if you want to contribute quickly for you, what are some of the examples of long-term projects that can be both EYP and outside of EYP? And then what is the characteristics for all of them? If somebody wants to start, I would be super happy to hear some input.
The most obvious one is the international session, obviously being a very long one that you work alongside the international office to create quite a large event over the span of many years.
Thank you. Anything else outside, perhaps, that you can think of now as a process that is for you a long-term project?
Well, I mean, outside of EYP, it's definitely going to be stuff like, acquiring a PhD and stuff like that, with, tremendous amounts of, getting into decent programs and also, actually doing stuff.
Thank you, Colin. I will go back to some of the things that I thought about. So I would say without, or if we take EYP aside, a few things that came to me as a business product launch for a high-end product. So if you have a big product to launch, it means there's a new technology, for example, associated. There's a process to get all the legal paperwork done. There's a lot of background things for this one event to be launched and to have a process. Also film production. I've also seen yesterday a news that Dune 2 has been moved 2 weeks in advance. The premiere dates have been moved 2 weeks in advance, and that's for November next year. And already they are in shooting process. So there's a lot going on for this like one premiere night and then a window of a few months where it will be released, and then there will be processes. Within EYP, we talk about international sessions, of course. We talk about projects that run for multiple years. One of them was the PowerShips project. It's finished recently, but we have entered a new project with the same foundation, and it featured multiple different events that in some ways are connected and lead to the same thing. Same goes with the training and capacity building event for 4 years that supported us with the multiple summer academies, which are the capacity building projects of EYP. And then what do they all have in common? regardless of whether they last for 2 years, 5 years, 6 years, one thing in common that includes a complex set of processes, multiple events, preparation, which is often not seen for kind of one or more or multiple big outcomes, big products. For the ISs in particular, for us, that's quite common. And we'll talk about it more, that we think of ISs as a project which lasts for 11 days, because it's 9 days for participants or for delegates, and then 2 more days of training, when in fact, those are 2.5 to 3 year projects. Why do we frame it that way? It's also now interesting for us to dive into a bit and to see what are all the things that come into place when we talk about this. And then the question is, what is unique about the EYP project and the framework that we work in? So I want to start with saying that it's volunteers. Everybody organizing an EYP event is a volunteer. And while it's youth-led and it's a great pitch for funders, they like to support youth events, or some of them like to support youth events, like to give us a platform to speak and do something. There are also drawbacks that come with the fact that you're volunteers. It's easy to be overworked. It's easy to get to a point where the project can impact your other commitments in life. And also when it comes to communication with different stakeholders involved, being partners or guests or just participants itself, there are different expectations when it comes to working hours. So, from participants who come to your project, they expect you to be available all the time to respond to questions, to engage, and that's just realistically not possible. Whereas also for the partners, they expect you to maybe be available for calls or meetings within a certain time frame, which is for them needed or desirable because it is their work. I think when it comes to niche communication, that's something in EYP that we need to be always very mindful of, not necessarily something to work on as to fix, but rather to be mindful on, where you are a head organizer of events yourself. I think when you speak externally, it's good for you to know, how do you want to present yourself? Are you a project manager or are you a head organizer? Because are you an organizer of an event? Because if you imply that you're an organizer of a few days of an event and you're a project manager of multiple months or even years, there's a very different expectation that you share with the participants or the stakeholders that you talk to. Again, related to it, we failed to present the full scope of our work. And there are lots of associated costs and events and processes leading up to a big event, be it a national session, international session, a training event. And I think it's really always good to be aware that as volunteers, you should not be, ideally, in an ideal setting, paying for things yourself that require you, that are associated directly with the project that you volunteer for. And then one big consideration, as for all projects, is we are a third-party funded network. All of your entities are third-party funded. So there's a heavy dependency in some cases on funders when it comes to altering the program, the topics, the schedules, and all of these things. Quite often, if they want to fund, they say, okay, let me have an evening where we get to speak, or we get to engage with participants, or we get to pitch our program, startup, our company, our university, whatever it is that you communicate with. Anything else I'm missing here? I mean, there's a lot, but I would actually be curious, what else do you think is unique about EYP that has been interesting for you to observe, or you want to share in this space with the others?
I think what's really unique about EYP is that no matter how tiring it can get, when we're participating in a session, we still manage to have a lot of fun and overall to have a great experience.
Thank you. That's one of the parts of validation that I think I'll speak quite a bit about later, but I think it's a very relevant point of why do people volunteer so much? Why do people invest so many hours? What is it that you get in return? That's very, very unique. And I hope, thanks. Colin.
I think one of the unique challenges of EYP, well, it does apply to a few other volunteer organizations as well, but the distances are way larger than for other more local projects. Operating often with an international team leads to large travel costs. A lot of time spent getting from one place to another. Very low flexibility when it comes to going missing for half a day even. That's something that's obviously very challenging to manage, particularly if you want to have multiple events with the same participants.
That is very true. Thanks, Colin. I think what I would sum it up as a bit of an intensity of our programs and how full sometimes our schedules can be. Even if you look at the most basic example of resolution typing or RESA typing, this incredibly exhausting process that we've normalized in a way, and to just think that that people are expected to then work the next day and have a full day of GA if it's not an IS. It's really just interesting to kind of bear in mind and to note when we speak about it. Cheap traveling opportunities. That is true. That is a very good opportunity, hopefully, that also incentivizes people. And in a way, especially if you're an official or in a volunteer position, when there is good funding and travel reimbursements, it's really nice to just meet new cultures. Thanks. I would maybe start with the first kind of pillar of today. There are a few pillars. The first one would be about, the first one actually I want to hear from you is, what do you think is kind of one of the most necessary things to make sure that the long-term project is kept well on track and is kept that there's a process and framework in place? What would be the first thing that comes to your mind, organizationally speaking, as a tool in a way that you would think of now in order to be able to keep track of the process going forward for such a long time? Theodora?
So I believe that making a clear plan of all the steps that we have to go through is extremely important, and we don't have to make it individually. So like, what do I have to do in this process, but more of a general plan. So what does everyone have to do? So maybe we could get like our responsibilities straight.
That is perfectly on point. Thank you so much. I wish if we practice this, it would not go better. I think it's really true that for me, at least, I would say is the essential skeleton of what a long-term project are the goals and milestones. So to really start off, and I can already share whenever we have an international session, and I will share now a bit with you examples of that. We start off with a long-term timeline process with a few milestones. And for me, one thing to highlight is that it's really important and useful to have a common working space where everybody involved, so the organizing team, but also us as, let's say, stakeholders that are engaged with you and support you, are able to work together and track those milestones. So there is no confusion. And one of the tools, it can be really, really simple to start with and then get more complex as the things go. But I want to show you one of the examples that we use for the IS teams that we work with. So you can see this is a bit of a also somewhat older, so it needs some refining, but it's just one example of all the different very specific points that are necessary to be checked in a way. And then ideally what we do when we start off during our first preparation meeting, in the column, we kind of write preliminarily months at least or dates of when we want something done. So even if the session is in, let's say, spring 2024, and we have our meetings now, we know in principle when we want to have a president selected because of one, second, third reason that is in place, because of policy in the end, but also just for organizational matters. And I think it's really good to clear up all of these disputes, if there are any, in a way, in terms of timeline early on. Because if I come and say, let's select the president in 2 months, and the session is in a year and a half, I think a very fair question would be, why would you do that? Why would you have, like, what is their role? Let's define their role and then see when it makes sense for them to join us. That also goes for the other things. And I think for us, with a long-term project in particular, it's so easy for things to get lost in the process and to get lost in the way, that having a one overview that's central and that you can always go back to is incredibly useful. Any comments, quick questions, contribution now before I move to a second part of the goals and milestones? Okay, in that case, I will continue. Just a quick few points. For projects, the milestones are a necessary way of having a good overview of goals and deliverables. So goals are things you want to achieve, and deliverables are things you want to produce in a way during the project element. Identifying them very early, it's really necessary. Even during the first meeting, you know what's your goal. Your goal is to have this event of 9, 10 days, or 5 days, or to have multiple events if it's a more complex project, like PowerShifts, for example, that we had. It had 4 different forums which were on the same theme across different countries. You need to know what kind of product you want, how many of them they are, and then list them in a bit of a timeline, just so you know also where your capacities go. Because if you have a 2-year project, or let's say 3 years project, you would ideally have event in each of those years, so they're not all together, because your capacities cannot support having 3 events in 3 months. Because of course it's very draining for a team. Also, in a financial sense, it can be very difficult. Identifying them very early, placing the big events or the big products in this large timeline, and then planning around it is really the key to make sure that you have a sustainable way to organizing an event and running a project in a way. Preliminary list is very helpful, like I showed you earlier. It's good to be created as a reminder of the milestones and goals. One of the things that Teodora mentioned earlier, which is really helpful, is to have tasks given to either organizations, if it's a partnership and consortium, or more internally, to people within the team. Quite often, if you're a organizing team in a way, you would have head organizers and you would have maybe core team members, and then core team would own different elements. So core team organizer for communications, for logistics, for finances. And then if we have a point which says grant writing, submitting this grant, you would know that the person who owns this, who has the responsibility to track and remind others, and at the end submit a grant, is an individual in your team that you need to support. But in a way, you also want to work with them and kind of give them some ownership to have. In the list, one thing that was missing that I think is very useful is to write dates and preliminary deadlines for teams to stick to. So if you already have Erasmus Plus, let's say everybody applies for the Erasmus Plus funding, their deadlines are known way in advance, and there is no real reason to kind of not plan accordingly if you plan long term. I think if you decide 3 days before the deadline, of course, it's very difficult. But if you have an event, if you have a 2-year event, there is at least 3 opportunities to apply for Erasmus Plus and to get feedback and to still make it to get funding before your event starts, let's say. And then one thing that we have as a practice with the ISs is a thing called green light. It's something that is a bit of a exercise for the governing body and us in the office to make sure to evaluate how feasible the project is. Because at the end of the day, any projects that we run in UIP are projects of the national committees, and we want to make sure that the national committees can sustainably survive those projects, to put it very bluntly. And for us, that means that every project that we run, event that we run within those projects, needs to be financially feasible. So it is important for you to know what data you need to scout. Is it the income only? Is it the partnership secured? Is it the venue secured? What is the data that you need to get in order for anything to be approved within your project? And I think for you is the point on include is to include all of these in a working space that you have. So everybody who works with you, either internally in your team or as a supporter in a way that we do with the ISs, would be able to go and check and see, okay, so our income is here, our budget expenses are here, how do we balance it out? Where are we 2 weeks before the session, 2 months before the session, 6 months before the session? Any questions or thoughts or interventions here? I would actually want to be curious to know what is your experiences with goals and milestones, and is there anything here that you want to add on or maybe challenge in a way? Kalina. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, it's actually kind of summarizing everything that you said so far. It's about setting smart objectives, because smart goals, because in that way you make sure that all of your objectives are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. So yeah, I think that's a really useful tool for long-term projects and projects at all, in general. So yeah.
Exactly. Thanks, Kalina. I think this is also a good way of kind of structuring a bit better, or making sure that the goals you set for yourself are easy to track, you know. So smart, as you said, is a one way of making sure that they are phrased even, or put together in a certain way that you can track really well whether you've achieved them or not. Thanks, Kalina. Anybody else? Okay. I think I will be moving to team management unless there's more about the general project management and goals and milestones and long-term timeline in a way. Let's maybe discuss it still now if you have any questions on that matter. I would then move on to team management, which is an important part of long-term project management. Could you maybe share with me, what do you think is kind of one thing that's important about kind of managing a team and their motivation for a long-term period, and to ensure that they stay motivated and they keep volunteering for the project that you're working on together, based on your experience or anything else? Feel free to speak up. I see a hand, so feel free to go ahead, Karina.
Okay, so in my experience, I think it's really important, in order to keep everyone in the team motivated, to kind of, to make sure that everyone knows that this is not only your project, but their project as well. So that in that way, they don't feel as if they're working for you, but that they're working for themselves and for a project that it's theirs. So yeah, I feel that like this is really important, and also communication and like regular checkups with your team, and not just giving tasks and not talking to them at all. So yeah.
Thanks, Karina. That's very useful. I think there are 2 points there. One is ownership, to allow people to really feel they can own something and do something. And there's a lot of trust exercise involved there. So we need to build trust within the team. And the second thing is to have smooth channels of communication. Anything to add there before we dive into maybe some of my reflections? James? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, I found it very useful that when you're working in a team, to ensure the motivation stays up, it's kind of building off the previous point on having clear set goals and milestones, so that when they do sit down to work on a project, that they can very clearly see what the next step is, they can work towards it, rather than working individually to try and figure out what they can do themselves to better the session, and to know what the team as a whole can do to better the session is a lot more efficient.
Thanks, James. And I think one thing I would add on top of that, so of course it's important to have a good overview of things coming up, but one thing I think is achievements channel in your working space, something very clear that also people can track once and then celebrate each other within the team when there are big milestones to be celebrated. Because I think, especially working long term, if you need to wait for that event to happen to feel satisfied, it's really draining and kind of difficult to stay motivated and involved. Anybody else, or should I move forward? I would then go with a bit of my reflections and share. So quickly from my side, there are some specific challenges when you work with a group of people for 2 years. Long-term works only is there as a community building exercise. And what I mean by that is what I've seen, at least with the teams across different international sessions, that a lot of motivation doesn't really come from delivering on the KPI, so on specific outputs or the promised thing that you get to a sponsor. It comes from a sense of community within the organizing team. So either a group of friends or a group of people who have become friends in this context over the time. And I think for us, it's very also useful to know what it means for the organizing teams, whether it's feasible to have very international teams, whether there needs to be some room or chance to be, more local to an extent, and then kind of meet also informally. There are quite a few of these things. I think it's really for you to figure out what does that mean for a project that you would run. What is it that is community building for your project and your group of people that you work with? And one thing to start with, of course, is our needs forms. What it means is that really it would be good to invest time into developing a really comprehensive way or tool to evaluate the needs of your team members and the people you work with. But of course, from that point, it's not just enough to use it and then forget about it, but to use actual content that people have shared about their hopes, expectations, about the way they like to be worked with and communicated with, and to kind of follow up on that. But also to use it as a review tool every 3 to 5 months in a way to get feedback, evaluate the points of stress or points where people are not, maybe, if you say you work with somebody and for 3 months they've been ghosting you, they've not been responsive, their tasks have been reallocated to different people. It's something that's so easy to kind of put aside and maybe try not to deal with for now because they might come around. But my suggestion is to always try to deal with it in a way that you evaluate what is the cause of it. Because sometimes it's just easier for people to have a chance to opt out or to maybe even drop out. But for the other way around, it's really useful when there are massive changes to the project. For example, with the Milano IS, they went from fully physical project to a fully digital one. And what the head organizers did, they had 2 instances where they asked people to opt in. So to say that they want to stay committed and stay working on a project. Because sometimes people, I think there's a bit of a peer pressure in a way environment that we create sometimes in these groups and processes that people feel bad about leaving or saying that they can't do something or they have no capacity to do something. And we are the project managers involved. It's their job in a way to make sure that that's easy for people. While of course, ideally that would not be the case and you would just use these forms to reflect internally, move things around, make sure who can get a bit more job, who can get a bit less job done, and kind of keep the team up to speed. In-person meetings help a lot. Also meetings, not just to work together and kind of do work, but really to rebuild the spirit, to kind of socialize and hang out at the end of the day. Of course, there's a financial consideration there. It's never a priority. If you look at the session, of course, the session costs are a priority. Everything else we deal with. But ideally, in an ideal setting, you would budget for it, you would plan accordingly, and you would plan already the times and spots for it way in advance. One thing with the teams in particular is that with long-term projects, pacing the calls for team members is really important. I want to say that having a really, really big team, of course, means you have more hands on deck. But for the HOs or the project managers, that also means more meetings, more one-on-one reminders, more reflections and feedback, just more resources fully devoted to team management. And I think while, of course, it's never good to select a team very late, I would also always be skeptical or highlight the skepticism of selecting people way too early, because if you're a project manager, your capacities to work on the project decrease as your capacities to manage a team increase. And I think it's really an exercise for any project manager to see, where do I want to have my time? Because if I want to actually have time to fundraise, for example, which is important in the very early stages, maybe it's better to invest 2-3 months and just do fundraising on your own or with a core team member, and then have more time dedicated to managing a team, but it really depends on every working culture. It's not one size fits all, and I think I really want to highlight that. And then one thing is I think it was mentioned earlier about having fun at sessions and enjoying sessions and enjoying this experience. That's one of the ways of validating volunteer work. Of course, that's a nice way, but for us, I would always encourage you to think beyond certificates. Is there a way that people who volunteer for EYP that you work with can benefit from it in their job, at their university, at their school, in any other way that you can credit it, or that you can ensure that there's a validation process in place and there is not too much for them to handle at the time. That also means a high quality experience for the organizers. I think quite often the organizers, and now I'm speaking particular from a project management perspective, are the team that kind of gets, the last point. If there's things to go over for the organizing team, they will be the last ones to figure it out. But I don't think that should be the case. And of course, it's really important for the organizers and your team members as project managers to have a high quality experience that also comes with a financial compensation for their costs of travel or food or participation in general, if possible. And then finally, but maybe the most important thing that we do is a learning experience for people to reflect on it and highlight what it is. Anything that you want to add here in terms of team management that's kind of useful to share in this group? If not, I will then speed up a bit just so we're also very mindful of time. I want to focus next on finances and fundraising. And I think I would start off with, when referring to projects in UAP, we talk about events, really. When you talk about the project as your national session, you're really talking about this event, right? But what I want to highlight in this webinar and the talk is that there's so much more going around it that we don't always fully present. And I want to highlight a few things that are, I would say, a must for any long-term project tracking. So the budget itself should not exist without the income tracking sheet. I think ideally, any team member that works with you or a partner that supports you in a way like we do from the office should be able to enter one sheet or one place and be able to tell you how much money you've applied for, where, how much money is spending, how much money has already arrived to your accounts and has been confirmed via a partnership agreement. I think that's really necessary because it's easy to get lost in this long-term process of where you are, who works on what, and ensuring that things are done well. A database is needed of both planned and existing partners and contacts. I think quite often it happens, especially for smaller projects, that somebody brings in a personal contact, but in fact, once they kind of touch base and engage in cooperation, they are a partner of a project. So it's really not ideal if somebody is sick from the team or somebody drops out for whatever reasons and you struggle to find ways to reach out to somebody. Attached to it is the last point, actually, to have a setup in place for seamless communication between parties and stakeholders. So if you're a project manager, I think at all times you should be kept in CC on communication and in the loop on threads and developments with different partnerships, but also just to make sure that it's easy to take over when people want to take a break, when they need to take maybe a few days or weeks off. It's really important that the project and the process does not suffer from on that matter. I would also suggest to keep track of personal costs because, as mentioned earlier, ideally they would be reimbursed, and it's so easy to pay for things and then just forget about them, and that shouldn't really not be the case. And as a major kind of point for budgets making, and I will show you now one in the next slide, but there should be multiple variants of budgets that you're working with a minimum budget would be a prime necessity to have, because that's what you need to know, how much money you need in order to have any session happen. It might not be your ideal session, but then we need to know, or you need to know as project managers, that if you have 50,000 euros and you cannot have an event below 65, let's say, You cannot announce people to book tickets. You cannot let people know to kind of plan further, and there has to be a decision made in a timely manner, going back to this milestones and goals kind of timeline. You need to know, and green light. You need to know at some point saying, we can either have this event with 2 days less, or with 200 or with 20 participants less, or in a certain way in order to have it feasible, or not have it at all. And that's important that participants don't have costs. I think the least ideal situation is if somebody, let's say, book tickets for an event that gets canceled, and that's not something that we want, or that a good project management allows for, really. I'm just going to show you one. This is all a draft or template budget for the IS. You can find it also on the member platform if you choose to apply, which I encourage you to do. The call is coming out very, very soon. So you are encouraged to already look into this database if that's interesting for you. But as you can see, I just wanted to highlight a few things. It's always important to have a good track of participant numbers, just so your budgets would be smart, ideally. What that means is that you don't have to always change the number of units manually, but rather program your Excel sheets in a way that allow for you to kind of just change number of delegates or number of teachers, and then the numbers align magically as in a way. What the other thing I want to highlight here is that there are some costs in preparations. So the organizers weekend is, I guess, the bare minimum of what you can at least try to budget for and plan for in advance. Furthermore, there are a few other preparation costs, but of course, the most essential costs in a way are costs of participation at the event. Venue rent, transport, catering, accommodation, travel reimbursements. Ideally, they are not in the ideal budget, but we try to provide as many as possible, and other expenditures and communication in general. There's a lot missing here in terms of long-term project management. So this is really an event budget. And I want to highlight that as a separate thing for you to note. But I do want to say that, and kind of going back to the ideal budget, it's always good to have the ideal budget in place and to use that budget to pitch to funders, because they really need to understand the scale of their project. So if you ask them to fund 20,000 euros, they need to understand that they only fund 10% of the event, or of the project in general, or maybe 20% depending on the size of the project, and that they are not entitled to boss anybody around based on their 20,000 euro contribution. It's really important to always highlight, it's in your interest and as project managers to highlight the really grand scale of the event and the project that encompasses it when you pitch it to partners and funders. That's one quick thing to note. And then maybe quick thing on what are we missing here actually. Travel budget for meetings, which are not just one organizing meetings, but let's say you as project managers, if you live in different cities and want to meet in person, that's something that should be covered by the project budget. Preparation, planning, evaluation. When you present the narrative of the project to a partner, ideally, you pitch it not as a 10-day event, but you pitch it as a, let's say, year-long or 2 years long or even 3 years long event that has its preparation phase, planning, implementation, which also includes that, chairs academic training for the IS. It's also in the implementation phase, but you just do training before the actual event happens. And then implementation of the event, and then evaluation process. And reporting process can last for a really long time sometimes. So it's really good for yourself to give yourself some time to work around these things and to breathe in between large milestones of the event. Tools to measure deliverables or things that you want to track, be it you make a post and you need to know how many people have seen that post on social media, because your partner is a very comms heavy partner and they will not give you money if it's less than 50 likes or 100 likes or whatnot. Their office costs are never included here, and I mean they should be, because of course it's a luxurious and privileged position to have an office when you're an NC in EYP. But it is something that, for example, Ljubljana IS has done really well, because during the planning process, so a year and a half around the project, around the event, they were given free office by the city of Ljubljana to work in, and it was conditioned by the project itself. So it is something that you could do and kind of pitch in if somebody, especially the governmental institutions, if they don't have money to give, because quite often they don't unless it's a very specific project, it's easier. Sorry, it's easier to ask for some in-kind sponsorships. And yeah, I'm actually curious again to hear from you. It's been really long time me speaking. In terms of finances and fundraising, what are we missing here? What do you want to object or add or ask on this specific topic? I would now open. I would have the floor open now if somebody wants to go for it. If that's the case, I would then maybe move it for the last Q&A section. I want to highlight that many of these things can be found on the member platform in the resources section, organizing. So there's a few guides. We are also working now on revising our IS organizing guide to be more updated by the end of the year. There are also best practices and examples of different things, including the sustainability, being innovative at your events, and so on and so on. And also, we might also include actually the webinar on this here. I will try to see if we can make it happen, or also it will be on YouTube. So this is something for you, or I'm also available via Slack or email or Discord now, apparently. I'm on EYP Discord. If you're not there, do join for any consultations in a way. Now is a big Q&A. Anything that you want to know that we haven't covered, that you want to suggest, ask, give, this would be a great time to do, because I still want to make sure that I don't take too much of your time, guys. Anything? If that's the case, there are no questions. I want to thank you for participation. I hope it was useful. I hope it inspires some of you to, organize your national sessions or international sessions. For that in particular, I am here to kind of talk to you, and I look forward to those projects actually. Let me know if you have any specific questions that you don't feel maybe comfortable asking now via email. And I would actually finish this on one quick note. Let me stop presenting. I would ask you kindly to fill out the evaluation form for this event, or the feedback form for us. It's actually very useful for us to know whether we should continue doing events or talks like these, to what extent, whether it was useful, helpful or not. It is here. It takes, I guess, 3 minutes, 4 minutes. So please do fill it out. I guess the best is as soon as we're done, but whenever you have time, I guess would be helpful. Thank you guys for participation. It was very nice, and I will stop recording now. So.